Hi guys, you're watching Halborn Flash Videos. I'm Arabdha, and today we're talking to liquid loans right now. So Christian, first of all, welcome and thank you for having this conversation with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And look, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate the time and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Definitely. We would love to hear a little bit more about your story. How did you get started into your journey into Web3 as well?
Look, it started from my brother-in-law, where he kind of introduced me to crypto. I think it was around 2017 or late 2016. And as you know, things were kind of very buoyant in those times. And I can remember the first crypto that I acquired, and I'll probably get shot down for this, but it wasn't Bitcoin. It was actually XRP. So he sent me some XRP, and he explained to me the whole concept of setting up a wallet. And it was, even at that point, it was, my God, it was confusing. All I can remember was thinking, oh, this is so confusing, but I'm so interested. And it was a very interesting start, and I'm forever grateful for his introduction to crypto. So Jason, if you're listening to this, thank you very much for getting me started. In terms of my own professional career, I mean, my background, look, I was a partner in a fairly significant global accounting firm. I led nationally here in Australia a part of that practice around people, but also had a technology focus. So my background has always been in technology, but not always necessarily in crypto. But I did have very much a focus around people management practices and how to incorporate technology into looking and measuring organizational performance and how the workforce has an impact on that. So I've always had that metrics focus, and I think that kind of helped with when I first embarked on crypto. But I must admit, my goodness, setting up a MetaMask account initially, I thought, what on earth am I doing with this thing? What the hell is a seed phrase? Why is this so bloody complicated? But it was, whilst it was complicated, and whilst it was quite a challenge to begin with, it was interesting, and it sort of whet my appetite for learning a little bit more about crypto.
Yeah, definitely. And 2016, 17 was like a rather crazy time as well. You did a shift from TradFi to DeFi and Web3. How was that transition like for you?
Look, it's interesting. I always go back to my TradFi roots. So a big part of the work that I was doing, I worked across a number of different industries, but one of the ones that I did a lot of work with, particularly here in Australia, was in the finance sector. So I kind of knew a little bit about how the finance sector operated. And look, by and large, and without sort of being too disparaging to traditional finance, it's some of the back of house systems are antiquated, right? So it's always the process of trying to patch the back of house systems. And one of the things that TradFi in particular now struggles with is front of house is very quick, right? So you've got dApps that can actually connect you very quickly to your financial assets, but it's the back of house that's problematic for traditional finance. And what I mean by that is it's what I'd regard as the settlement layer. So for transactions to be settled, you need a settlement layer. And a lot of the systems that are used to do that are fairly antiquated and have been largely patched over a period of time within traditional finance. So it's no surprise to me that at the moment, what traditional finance is struggling with is the speed of transaction at the front end is, second to none. And there's a lot of the new wave TradFi organizations that are very good at that, but it's the settlement layer that's really clunky and slow. And I think that's the biggest challenge for TradFi is how do we ensure that these transactions are settled within a reasonably quick period of time, without sort of the constant challenge between doing something very quickly and then having to settle things in the background. The balance then with DeFi for me, I think the biggest difference is, and I'd put it down to one word, and that's counterparty, right? So for me, DeFi represents an opportunity for communities to corral to provide finance to an individual. So no longer are you having to deal with an organization or a central organization having to provide you with the financial wherewithal to do what you need to do. What we now have is communities collaborating to get an outcome to facilitate financial type transactions without the need of a central body or without a counterparty risk. So for me, DeFi is definitely the way of the future. The challenge is obviously is that there's a healthy tension between TradFi, DeFi, and dare I say some of the regulators in terms of how quickly this sort of evolves. But I honestly don't think there will be a future where DeFi is definitely the predominant. Unfortunately, that's going to take a little while to get there. And I think there's going to be quite a battle ahead for organisations heading down this path. This type of change doesn't come without a fair bit of, I guess, challenges. And I suspect that, it's not going to be an easy road, but I do feel that the future is very much DeFi. And in part, our view of the world is that they can coexist and there will be a transition. So we're not necessarily completely against TradFi, but I do feel that DeFi is the future.
Got it. So challenges, time, regulations. We talked about a lot of pain points as well while talking about DeFi. Speaking of pain points, what was the major one that you addressed while you were creating liquid loans?
I think the biggest issue for us was, and rather selfishly, I should point out that whilst I'm the CEO of Liquid Loans, I'm one of the co-founders. My other co-founder, Dave, or Scottish name, Dave as he is known, he and I came together when we first looked at sort of investing in PulseChain, and both of us were particularly interested in what Richard Hart, the founder of PulseChain, was doing. We have invested fairly significantly into PulseChain. And I can remember saying to Dave, I said, look, we've got an investment here, but one of the major issues with a lot, and this tends to happen in crypto more broadly, is that you acquire these crypto assets, but traditional finance or outside of crypto, the asset itself isn't necessarily valued to the same way. And so, for example, if you're wanting to borrow or extract value from your crypto assets, generally the default position for most people is to sell them. And I would argue that that's probably the last thing you'd want to do, particularly for a crypto asset that potentially has the opportunity of appreciating in value. The analogy I could give you would be, it would be like wanting to borrow against your home or wanting to acquire a motor vehicle, but selling your house to do that, to extract value, doesn't make a lot of sense. So typically what people would do is they'd say, well, I've got a home and I've got plenty of equity in the home and I'd like to buy a new car, for example. Why can't I borrow against that equity to acquire the car? The upside of that is I haven't sold my house, or I haven't sold the asset that's appreciating in value. And at the same time, I've been able to acquire a car using that original asset as the collateral to enable that to happen. So we sort of embarked on this for the same reason, is that we thought, look, we don't necessarily want to sell our asset. In this case, it's PulseChain. We didn't want to do that. What we wanted to do, however, was to be able to extract value by borrowing against the asset and doing so in a way that enabled us to then invest in other areas or to do whatever we will with the amount that we borrow, but do so that at a safe collateral level so that we're not potentially subjected to a liquidation. And I think for us, that was the major motivation. We didn't want to have to sell the underlying asset. And I guess the other aspect of that is that typically when you sell crypto assets, or any assets for that matter, is that there potentially is a taxable event that occurs. So if the asset has appreciated in value, you may be subjected to capital gains tax, subject to your jurisdiction and the regulations in that area. But again, if you're borrowing against the original asset and you haven't technically sold it, then you're not actually creating a taxable event. So we kind of feel that this is a really good way of extracting value without creating a taxable event, on the basis that you do that in a very conservative way. So don't overextend. Don't create a situation where you may end up being liquidated because you've not provided enough collateral to cover the borrowing.
Got it. That was actually a great example to explain the concept of liquid loans with the house and the bike. Speaking of, how do you think liquid loans today is different from the rest of the platforms trying to do the same thing around here? So the rest of the lending protocols, how do you differentiate it?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that there's no, some of the other lending platforms, they go into an auction process. So if somebody actually sort of goes below a certain collateral level, there's usually an auction process, which is quite cumbersome and not always the best use of the collateral. So one of the things that we find that within liquid loans is that people can borrow up to 110% of the amount of collateral that they put forward. So the collateral ratio is quite high, which is a very efficient way of using your collateral. We wouldn't normally recommend that people would do that, but that is still a possibility. The difference here is the community determines. So if you fall below that level, it's the community that makes the decision as to whether or not you need to be liquidated. So the protocol itself doesn't do that. It allows for that to happen. And it's a very efficient mechanism. Because the protocol's decentralized, we have no control over how people decide to use the protocol. But what we do know is the mechanics of the protocol enables a very efficient way of liquidating those that fall below that collateral level. And also, I guess that the upside for us is that we're deploying our project on the basis that it's immutable. So we're not making any changes. There's no admin keys. There's no opportunity for nefarious acts that may occur. And we've seen this with other projects where they do have admin keys, and that always, again, it introduces that counterparty risk. We don't want that in this protocol. This protocol is for the community's use, and they'll benefit from that on the basis that it is immutable. We obviously have developed it in such a way, and we'll be deploying in such a way that it's censorship resistant. So anyone can actually add a front end to the protocol itself. And as a consequence of that, it's once the protocol is launched, there's really no stopping it. And the upside of that is that people don't have to rely on a third party or a centralized organization to actually manage liquidations of any sort of borrowings that may fall foul of collateral ratios.
Got it. So some of the differentiating aspects, as I understand, is the high collateral to 110%, the community itself, the immutability of it, and the censorship resistance. Perfect. So talk to us a little bit more about the loan token and the USDL tokens.
Yeah, there's two tokens. Good question. So there's two tokens that are issued. One of the things that we'll be doing when we actually launch liquid loans is people will have to lock up their collateral, in this case, Pulse. And by doing so, they're able to mint a stable coin. And the stable coin is USDL. The beauty of the stable coin is it's 1 USDL is equivalent to $1 worth of Pulse. Now, if Pulse goes up and down, it's still worth $1 worth of Pulse. So however many Pulse tokens that requires, that will always match to the stable coin that's issued. The benefit of that is that it is effectively a stable coin that is decentralized. Unlike centralized stable coins such as USDC or USDT, there's no reliance on effectively a third party ensuring that the reserves are there. This is purely met by people locking up their tokens, and the collateral is created, or rather the stable coin is created based on the collateral that's made available. So that's the USDL stablecoin itself, and it has significant utility given that it is a stablecoin. On the flip side, we do have a yield-bearing token that we call the loan token. Now, the benefit of the loan token is effectively when the protocol is issued, there is potentially there will be an allocation of loan tokens made available. Those loan tokens can be used by the system to generate yield. So what we're hoping is that people will use the loan token to actually stake those loan tokens and actually generate yield by staking the tokens. Now, there is a point of difference between the staking mechanism that we're using compared with, say, staking mechanisms for most other protocols, even outside of DeFi. I think fundamentally the reason why most protocols offer some sort of incentive to stake is because if you stake, you're actually not tempted to sell, right? So the whole idea is you want to ensure that people actually hang on to their tokens, and they're less likely to sell the tokens, which would place downward pressure on price. So the mechanism for staking, I believe, is largely intended to maintain the price of the token and to actually put upward pressure on the price. The difference here is that for most staking, for most protocols, you're actually rewarded in the token that you're staking. So that creates a dilemma in that if you're actually being provided or rewarded in the same token that you've put up to stake, then there's a very good chance that you'll end up selling those tokens, which again sort of defeats the purpose. It puts downward pressure on the token. The difference with ours is that what happens when you stake those tokens, you're paid in 2 additional tokens. So you're not actually paid in the loan token itself. You're actually paid in USDL, and the USDL comes from the fees that are generated every time somebody takes out a loan using the protocol. There's a certain portion of USDL that is actually provided to people that stake, and that's based on the amount of borrowings. There is another mechanism called redemptions. And so redemptions are when you take your USDL and you want to have the asset returned to you, in this case, Pulse, then a portion of the Pulse is also made available to people at stake. So whilst loan token is a yield-bearing token, you're not paid in loan token. You're actually paid in this case, it's going to be USDL and Pulse. And so as a consequence of that, there's no further pressure on selling the loan token at all. And so my personal view is that the loan token is purely a yield-bearing token, and it actually rewards you in tokens that have no relationship directly, at least with the loan token. So we see that as a really healthy mechanism for staking, and very different to some of the other staking mechanisms you may see.
Yeah, some of the staking mechanisms as well as the tokenomics generally is super interesting from what you just explained. So where's the product roadmap at? I know you guys released the testnet, so congratulations on that. When is the next stage coming in?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we've had is, look, PulseChain it's a fairly new layer 1. The challenge has been, as with most layer 1s that just start, is there's not a lot of infrastructure. And so what do I mean by that? Well, some of the infrastructure that we need for deployment included things like, and you may be familiar with Gnosis Safe. So Gnosis is the multi-sig tool. We've had to actually deploy that separately for PulseChain. And so we had to invest some time to make sure that we understood how Gnosis Safe worked. We've obviously gone through a series of testing of that particular protocol. We've forked the contracts, but we've had to make a significant number of changes to the UI to ensure that it works on PulseChain. So we've deployed that on mainnet. It's still in private. So we have it on mainnet, but it's still private until we just resolve a couple of UI changes that we need to make. But we've had to go through this process. So we kind of wished it was easier than that, but we've had to go through that with Gnosis. Gnosis hasn't been... it's been challenging, to be perfectly honest. It hasn't been easy to do that. A lot of the UI changes that we had to introduce, we had to make sure that it obviously worked as we had expected. And so we spent a fair bit of time to make sure that that's the way it is and that it's working correctly. Now that it is, I think once we've made some cosmetic changes, we'll make that available to the community. In addition to that, one of the things that, I'd suggest that most DeFi projects require some sort of price feed of some description. Now, one mechanism you could use would be a decentralized exchange. So you can go to a DEX and get the price for the underlying asset that you're looking to use, in this case, Pulse. And whilst that's okay in principle, it's actually fraught with a lot of risk, because if it's the only price that you're getting, if something happens to a liquidity pool on that decentralized exchange, all of a sudden your prices fail. So the best outcome is to have an Oracle service. Now, again, given that PulseChain was relatively new, there was no Oracle service. When we first started, we had conversations with Chainlink to see if there was an opportunity that they may come over. At that point in time, it wasn't on their it wasn't on their radar. And I dare say that they may come over in the future, but the timing of that didn't help us. Thankfully, we formed a fairly strong relationship with the guys over at Telor. So Nick Fett, the CTO there, he and I sort of had fairly lengthy conversations. He's working with our team, and some of their team are also working with our team to actually fork Telor. But instead of actually bridging in their tokens to make it work on PulseChain, what we've done is we've launched basically a fork of Telor, and it's called Fetch. So Fetch is the Oracle service that is native to PulseChain. And so we're in the process now of concluding all of the necessary internal tests for us. You may or may not be aware, but I think one of your team is actually going to start or has started to audit the code for Fetch. So the contracts need to be reviewed. Because it's such an integral piece for what we're doing, it was important that we had the code audited. So our expectations are that, we don't expect too many changes required for that. Once that's concluded, then we're in a position to say, okay, thankfully we've got PulseChain Safe, which is the Gnosis fork. We've got Fetch, which is the Telor fork. That's all up and running. And whilst you guys have actually concluded the review of the liquid loans contracts, we're kind of waiting. So that's the third cab off the rank. So as soon as those other two are actually deployed and working, we're then in a position to launch liquid loans for the community.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of things are in the works very soon. Well, we talked a little bit about the security work together on multiple sub-projects, as I see. Tell us a little bit about the internal security strategy that you have at Liquid Loans, and also why did you choose to partner ahead with Halborn?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think most folk understand the need for auditing, and particularly for DeFi protocols, where I think the biggest risk that we always face is the threat of a breach of the contract or some particular problem with the contract, and particularly when we're talking DeFi, where could be significant amounts of total value locked at risk. It's really important to make sure that the contracts are actually rock solid. And to speak of that particular process, we did go through quite an extensive process of running through a number of other audit teams, some of the very big ones, including some that you may know. One of your representatives there, he presented Halborn in such a strong light. We kind of really liked and we gravitated to how building a relationship with the auditor was really important for us. So this wasn't just purely a transaction. Whilst it may be perceived as a transaction because we're having something audited, the relationship aspect was really important. So we wanted to have conversations with the auditor as we're going through, just to sort of highlight any issues that come up, that we could have those conversations. And I think by and large, it's been a really good experience for us with Halborn. That's only part of it, though. So I appreciate that, whilst the contract risk is the biggest risk, or one of the biggest risks, there are other things that we've actually had to put in place. And so, for example, we've got a fairly extensive quality assurance process. So all of our testing, our process, our deployment, all of that has to be rock solid. And as much as you can check contracts, you also need to make sure that your infrastructure is going to be protected. And so we've gone just to as much length to make sure that all the infrastructure is in place, and that's also being tested. And so from our point of view, it's not just purely having the contracts reviewed, it's also making sure that the infrastructure is going to hang together nicely. And in addition to that, we also have to secure ourselves from within. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have certain security levels on various code changes. So not everyone in the development team gets access to all of our repos. So, there is a process that we follow, and it's I guess there's an element of cybersecurity that we need to be mindful of, and we have a cybersecurity expert that's given us some guidance along that path. So I guess overall, we're doing everything we possibly can to make sure that when we deploy, given that it is immutable code, that our infrastructure is fine, that a code's been audited, that it's gone through significant QA, and we're also very cognizant of any cyber risks that may come up, and how we deal with those things. So my background has been development, whilst it hasn't always been in crypto. Some of it has been very mission critical deployments. And so there's a necessary part of making sure that you dot the I's and cross the T's on all of this. And whilst it's important to do that, sometimes communities don't always appreciate the amount of time that it takes to do those things. And everyone wants everything deployed yesterday. Patience is important, right? But yeah, I think, hand on heart, I do feel that we're doing everything possible to mitigate all of the associated risks, not just purely contract risk.
Got it. Yeah, that does seem like a very holistic take on security. And yes, indeed, like people want everything done yesterday, which is not really sustainable when it comes to security, right? And as we know, this was a great conversation, Christian. Thank you so much for joining me on this chat today. I hope the audience enjoyed as much as I did. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for your time.